Thank you so much for coming. It's very appropriate that we're starting off a discussion on inequality among all these very expensive coffee table books showing palace interiors. So I think I'll start off with sort of a quote from your book where you say, anyone who thinks that inequality is unjust and undesirable must endorse the imposition of some form of upper limit to wealth. It's a very bold, very compelling argument, but I thought maybe we could start off by you just speaking briefly as to what is limitarianism.
Yes, thank you. So, should I also defend that claim? Yeah. So so I think inequality is really the distance between. I see this in terms of a distribution of wealth or income between one side and the other side. And inequality, if you're against inequality or you want to reduce it, it means you have to bring the two sides closer together. That means those that are very poor and those that are very rich. And we have tended to look at those that are very poor, and actually many very rich people and I call them well-meaning business people. Actually, when they care about inequality, when they use the word, actually they are really talking about what can we do to reduce poverty. But inequality is a distance between the two sides. And that means that I think if we want to bring everybody, I think nobody will defend poverty. So we want to bring everybody above the poverty line, whatever that would be. But if you then want to reduce inequality, it means basically, I think by logic, that there must be an end to how rich people can become. And then the question is if you make, and basically limitarianism is the claim, there must be a limit to how rich you can become. I mean colloquially. And yeah, I think that as a working definition, that should work.
Excellent, okay. Well, I'm looking forward to getting into how we define what that limit should be. I think before we get into that, I'm just curious how you came to this topic. Was there any sort of personal experience you had or a trajectory in your research that led to this topic being of interest? Has this been a long-standing interest of yours?
Yeah, so I think the most important element in my research specialization is distributive justice. So questions of justice, but then really about questions of inequality and fair burdens and so on. And I mean, in political philosophy, we have all these very abstract theories of inequality. Most of the time, it is theories of equality of opportunity, and then they're fleshing out when can you say that somebody really has a genuine opportunity. But the problem is that if you think about the real world, of course, in some cases we can say somebody doesn't have an opportunity when there is racism or sexism or something else that is clearly identifiable as not being a case of not having a real opportunity. But if you think about economic inequalities like wealth and income, how can you really say that how can you determine or observe that there are no opportunities? And the problem with opportunities, or the theories of equality of opportunity, is also that they tend to have a lot of hypothetical conditions. So everybody must have had a fair chance in life to develop their talents and so on. But what do you do with adults that didn't have that fair chance? So these theories are very idealized. So I think we have to have more political philosophy and reasoning that is about the world we can observe. Mm-hmm. And that's basically how, from this more abstract reasoning, I came to think about what can we say about inequalities that we observe. Mm. So I have my own personal experience. I just grew up middle class. So I neither grew up poor, nor did I grow up rich, so that hasn't really played a role in this research interest. Yeah.
Excellent. So in terms of the goal of this particular book, what were you setting out to do with this book, and what was the process like in terms of researching, writing? Were there things that were sort of new for you in taking it on? Were there things that were sort of surprising or that you learned along the way?
Yeah, so there's also a number of scholarly papers that I wrote on limitarianism, and they're all open access, so you can go and find them on the internet. And if you were to do that, you will see that they're very different from this book. So basically, they start from the academic discussions on distributive justice, and then they ask how would an upper limit to wealth fit into those theorizing. So basically what academic philosophers typically do is they start from the theories and then make a contribution. And this book, of course, is not theory-driven. It is problem-driven. It really asks, we have all these multimillionaires and billionaires in a world on fire, a world with persistent poverty, a world with political corruption. Is this a problem in that world? And if you start from a problem in the world, you can't say, I'm a philosopher and now I'm going to do philosophical analysis. You just have to go into those fields and subfields where there is knowledge that's relevant for answering that question. So for example, I had to read up on corruption, political corruption, on kleptocracy, on, and also on particular cases like Berlusconi, Putin, African dictators. And that to me was, some of this was new. I mean, some of this I just had been a newspaper reader like all of us, but I had to go and do the research. No, not actually do the research, but read the research. So that was new, this really kind of quite getting out of the academic boundaries of disciplines. And then the other thing is that I took a further step in writing for everybody. My aim was to write a book that would be, hopefully, readable by as many people as possible without saying things that are not true. And that is really like, how far can you go in making things accessible? And are there sort of writing techniques you can use? Like, for example, bringing in examples, bringing in so people I interviewed to make it more, I would almost say digestible. And one of the things I did in this book that I'd never done before is I interviewed super rich people. It's not that I didn't, I mean, I should say I kind of never thought about it, but I was interviewed for American television. It was screened in January 22, I think 22. There was the interviewer asked me after a very long interview, of course they only show like 10 minutes, but after a very long interview asked, so have you discussed this with very rich people, with millionaires themselves, your theory? And I said, well, if I give a public lecture, there have been organizers that have tried to invite millionaires, but they refuse to be on stage with me. And they cite security issues and so on. And then he said, well, but if they were, would you like to, I mean, if they were to want to speak to you, would you do that? I said, of course. And would you be willing to have them change your mind? I said, of course, if they have good arguments, I will listen to them and I will change my mind if I need to. I said to him, anybody can Google me, so please let them get in touch with me. Of course, they didn't screen that. But this made me really think that I should try to get in touch with the people I'm also talking about, but how, if they're not in your networks, do you find multimillionaires? And then what happened was that the UK Patriotic Millionaires, which is a group of activist millionaires, got in touch with me because of some research that I did, and we had a conversation and I shared them my knowledge and advice. And then at the end, this organizer asked me, this is fantastic, can I do something for you? And then I thought, actually, yes. Mm-hmm. Could you bring me in touch with some people who might want to speak about their experiences and just reflect with me on this theory? And then basically a snowball thing went. Mm. So I started to speak with some, they brought me into contact with others. I also pretended at some point to be a journalist in order to get in touch with some of them. So there were some tricks that I used. And so I've interviewed a number of them. I've also interviewed organizations that try to bring this issue of having a lot of money and what one should do with it, or how we should politically organize to reduce inequalities to the public realm. And I found that very illuminating.
Excellent. Are there any millionaires or billionaires in the audience right now? We can continue. So I guess as related to that, when you were discussing some of the consequences of inequality, you were looking not just at things around climate or political inequality, we're looking at some of the psychological difficulties of being super wealthy and some of the intrinsic problems with being super wealthy, as opposed to more consequentialist ones, which maybe is coming more from your philosophical background. So maybe you could talk a little bit about why being super wealthy has some intrinsic moral difficulties.
Yes. So this is basically the argument that it's for super wealthy people themselves actually often not so good to have so much money. And this is one chapter in the book. And I should say it's hard to find research on this. And that is because what we know from quantitative research is that always the people at the two edges of the distribution, so the either very poor people living on the street or people in institutions and so on, but also the very wealthy, it's very difficult to include them in quantitative research. There are some ethnographers who've done research really focused on the very wealthy, but most of them not really on psychological effects of wealth. But still what I found, and then also a very, very illuminating interview I had with Abigail Disney, who is a multimillionaire living here in New York, really made me understand that at least for, I don't know what I should now say, like a sizable group of the multimillionaires, or it might be even a risk for all of them, there are really burdens of having that wealth. And it has to do with several different kind of psychological mechanisms. Abigail Disney described, for example, that she saw with her, so she's the granddaughter of one of the two founders of the Disney park in California, that she saw her grandfather, that his social, no, it was not her grandfather, the father, she saw the social circle narrowing. So because if you're so wealthy, and she also described this for her own life, everywhere she goes, there are people who, she enters a room and somebody wants something from her. So I'm here and I'm not worried that any of you will ask me something, because I mean, you can ask, but I have nothing really to give, or at least nothing sizable. But of course, if you're known to be rich, and there's always somebody, so you kind of always a target. And the way to avoid this is to basically narrow your social circle. Or you have to be not known as being a multimillionaire, but that is not possible for many of those people. And then, of course, if your social circle narrows to like-minded people, you have I mean, I don't think this is good for any of us. Mm-hmm. And she also says that with some of these really billionaires who have, like, of the type, say, category Musk or Bezos, she says you can just see that their character changes over time, because they act as if they are the sun in the room. That's the metaphor she uses. And if they leave the room is dark. Mm-hmm. So there's this, so it's this question also about ego development. I'm not a psychologist, so I've tried to kind of not make big, bold claims about this, but so that is why I think it would be, why there is also burdens on the super rich themselves of being so rich.
Yeah, and I would just add to that when you're, as you bring out in your book, when you're that wealthy and you know at any given moment you could be saving someone's life or starting any number of other good causes, you're making a deliberate choice not to do that, and it requires you to see others who need your help in some ways as either shunning them, seeing them as less than human, and a number of other strategies.
Yeah.
And that has its own kind of corrosive effects. So in terms of actually setting these limits, I think you sort of distinguish between a political and more of an ethical or personal criteria for doing this. So
Yeah.
how do you sort of go about determining these limits?
Yeah, so the difference between the political upper limit and the what I call voluntarily or ethical upper limit is that I think we should organize the economic system, which will then lead to the political upper limit, in such a way that we still allow for positive incentives for people who need financial incentives in order to contribute. I've formulated it like this because not everybody actually needs financial incentives. We have plenty of people who, for example, work in the public sector, who actually just constantly go an extra mile and they don't earn any other money, any additional money. But there are people who would just say, well, but if I can't just continue earning more and more or having more and more profits, I'm not going to put in the extra effort. So that is a reason why, if you want to have more economic growth or have more innovation, you want to allow for people who really want to have those higher earnings. That's a very pragmatic argument. There's actually philosophical work who says we shouldn't morally give into this, but I just think, well, that just assumes that people don't have those motivations, whereas we see that people do. So no, not people, but some people do have those motivations or those behavioral reactions. So that's why there are two limits. The lower limit would be determined mainly by the question, how much do you need to have a good life? I mean, you can just have more money and just have more money, but at some point, what does additional money bring you? You can, of course, spend it, but it won't really increase your quality of life. I think that for the Netherlands, and I did some research on this with my colleagues from economic sociology, it's of course, people disagree where that limit would be, but we think that 1 million euros would be, well, I should put it like this, our respondents say that, or the majority of our respondents say that at 1 million euros, people have all they need for a maximally good life. However, this is context relative. The Netherlands has a public pension scheme, public pension system, which makes sure that everybody is just above all people who do not have who have not saved for their pension, are at least at the poverty level. And we also have a healthcare system that is mixed public-private, but in any case, you don't have to save for a health emergency. And that is, of course, if you have those two things, it means, of course, you have to save much less than if you do not have those features in your country. I think the reasons I have in the book for why we should limit wealth have to do with so what I just mentioned, which is a classical utilitarian argument that at some point having more money doesn't really contribute to your quality of life. It's also that having lots of money doesn't go together with ecological sustainability, because we see that the carbon footprint of the wealthy people, but actually not just only the 1%, but I should say the 10% is disproportionately large relative to what's sustainable, both because of their lifestyles, but also because of their investments. So those are two arguments. Then there is the democratic argument that very rich people, because they have so much money, it means that the opportunity cost of them spending their money becomes kind of zero. If you have, say, let's just say something, you have $50 million, and there is a candidate for politics who asks you for a significant donation that will help that person to run a political campaign, and you decide to donate, like what, $100,000. If you have 50 million, and then you have 49,900,000. It doesn't change anything. But if you or I were to give $100,000, yeah, this would be a problem. So that means that, and this is what we see also and what political scientists say, that the super rich have a disproportionate influence on politics via their donations, via lobbying, and also because they can buy up what is actually an essential element for a healthy democracy, which is media. So the newspapers, television chains, and also social media. And in order to reduce all those harms, you can always try to build walls, like you could, or you can have additional measures. You can say, for example, we will have campaign legislation. But even like in my country, where those laws are very strict, we still see that rich people try to find ways around. And the upper limit is, it's kind of, I would almost say, my best guess for where I think the harms of those negative effects of having too much money are, at least they might not be eliminated, but at least lowered. And I know this is, I know this is just a number. I mean, the 1 million is actually based also on some research, because we've done some research in the Netherlands. But the 10 million, I could also have said another number, but I want to make clear it's not 1 billion. Because of course we've had that argument here, especially in the US before, there shouldn't be any billionaires. I would say, yes, obviously there shouldn't be any billionaires, but that aspiration is too low.
Excellent. I think that leads well to another point that some people bring up, which is why aren't we focusing more on poverty exclusively rather than targeting the upper limit? Why shouldn't we just focus on the lower limit? And I think what you just said sort of gets at why poverty is sort of an insufficient locus of our attention, but maybe you can expand a little bit about poverty and how that sort of could be an additional but not sufficient front in trying to tackle inequality.
Yes, so the interesting thing is that because I've published research on this over the last 10 years, but also some newspaper articles, and the Dutch version of my book came out in November, and since then I've also been approached by, actually, I increasingly get into touch with multimillionaires, and what some of them say themselves is that in their networks they do talk about inequality, but actually when they use the word, they mean poverty. And the same thing with Davos. So Davos for years has been saying, yeah, they talk about world problems, and of course sustained poverty is a problem, but they never talk about whether there would be any problem with people having a lot of money. So, well, that's not surprising, because they would have to critically look at themselves, and yeah, that's not what they do. So the reason we can't just focus on poverty is, I think there are two broad categories. One is the harms of extreme wealth concentration, about which I already talked. The other one is that poverty and wealth are related, because some of the measures that have actually created or have allowed wealth concentration to expand are facilitated by the government, and they are a zero-sum. I mean, if you allow tax deductions, and that means you have less tax revenue that you can use for anti-poverty programs, well, it's clear that the two are related. I think in all areas of tax there are some zero-sum elements. And then there is what I think is the most philosophical argument, which is that I have a chapter in the book in which I argue that nobody can actually say they morally deserve so much money. So that is actually a critique on meritocratic thinking. And behind this reasoning is a view on human nature, whereby I think those who are who believe that if one has talents and then puts in the effort, that then one deserves what one can reap on the market, that they have a view on human nature whereby you can claim credit for your talents and for your energy levels and for your health and for the people who raised you, but the truth is, these are all matters of luck. You didn't choose your parents, you didn't choose your genes, you didn't choose your talents, you didn't even, I believe, and this is I think already perhaps one of the more controversial, I think we don't choose to a large extent our energy levels. So if you are somebody who really can make long working days and you have a lot of creativity or you're very smart, you're just incredibly lucky. Whereas what we do is, we say, yeah, this person has done all those great things and then therefore they deserve this fortune. And I think people should of course be admired for their talents and they should be applauded for what they do with those talents, but not necessarily in terms of money.
Yeah, no, and I would add to that just, especially when there's multiple forms of cognition and multiple styles of thinking, you know, this reality of neurodiversity. We live in a society where only certain kinds of forms of thinking are rewarded, and we have the idea of the neurotypical individual who is thinking very logically, very rationally, and most of us are not that type of person. And as long as opportunity structures are only rewarding one style of thinking, it's going to be limiting opportunities for the rest of us, and you can't say that those who were born with a certain habit of thinking, who happen to fit that norm, just happen to deserve, you know, everything that came to them, because in many ways it's been a very unequal structuring.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And you asked me at the beginning to what extent my whether I had any experiences that made me write this book. I should say that one of the, I mean, there's very little kind of personal in this book, but this view on human nature that I think is correct, actually I have seen confirmed by the fact that in my private life or among my friends and so on, I have very diverse people in my social bubble, if you want. So I have just seen people with what we would nowadays call mental health issues and so on, but you know, they just had incredible bad luck. And what we do is we just, as a society, we tend to blame them. But I think that's a wrong reaction. The reaction should be compassion and support. And the same with energy levels. I mean, I am myself somebody who actually I'm blessed with being able to work really hard. But it's just, you know, good luck. So you should basically kind of be grateful for the fact that you can do this rather than just say, ooh, look at me. And that's a problem that the dominant ideological culture that we have tends to say, oh, but they've been really energetic and really entrepreneurial, and therefore they earn all these millions. Yeah. So and there we are really at the level of ideas and ideology. So I think the changing the world into a more caring world and with less inequalities will require not just measures, say, at the fiscal level, but also at the level of how we look at each other, how we conceive each other.
Excellent. Yeah, and I guess that was sort of my next question in terms of the policies and the mindsets that will be needed to start passing some of these limits. And I think the fiscal element is very important, sort of redistributing after the fact, but you also speak to the need to stop inequalities happening before they begin. Yeah. And maybe you could speak a little bit about sort of the other policies that you think will be necessary to create a limitarian kind of society.
Yeah, so I think, so here I'm of course also learning a lot and building on the work that people did who studied what happened in, say, North America and Europe over the last 70, 80 years. And what we've seen is that shrank a bit or has weakened. Some people would say, I don't think they would say it's abolished, but it has become more neoliberal, also blaming the poor and blaming the vulnerable. But we still have, in many countries, say, a legal role, for example, for unions. So that, because in the end, there is a way to look at this whole problem. It's not really completely a problem between the analysis that I make in the book between the classical distinction that political economists would make between capital and labor, because I think we also, I mean, that I think is you could use that set of concepts to analyze the world. I haven't done this, I've chosen other concepts, but there is some of it, of course, very visible in the analyses that I bring together. And that is that, and also in what the data show, is that wages have been left behind, and those who have their income or their wealth from wealth, so basically they have capital earnings, or those who have profits, they've always taken a bigger share of the pie. So that means that there is also, behind increasing inequalities, there is this classical tension between workers and those who, and what you want to say, employers or capitalists. And then we can actually go back all the way to Adam Swift, not Adam Swift, who is a colleague in London, Adam Smith, who has an interesting passage somewhere in his famous book that's often seen as the founding book of economics, where he describes the pin makers, and he says, so how are these wages determined? And then he says, well, the shop owner, the workshop owner, he has a buffer. He has capital, so he can wait. But the workers, they have mouths to feed. So they will have to agree with whatever, like, wage the pin shop owner is willing to give them, where they can still survive. And so that mechanism, so if there is no kind of organization of labor, the wages will go down and down. And I think this is, of course, I mean, with the, under Reagan, we've seen really I mean, you're a historian, you know more about this than I do, but under Reagan and the whole neoliberal revolution, we've seen this, what you could really see as an attack on organized labor. So I think this is really one of the most important things that we should do, but I hesitate to say this, but I have a sense that many citizens have also become depoliticized and no longer really fully aware of the fact that it's so important to know about how the economy is structured and to know what your role is in it and to know what possible scenarios are and which one you might want and then where you have to fight for. Because one of the things that neoliberal ideology has done is to really turn us onto ourselves and make us see ourselves as a customer, somebody who invests in our own human capital. We're no longer a student, but we are an investor in our own human capital. So, whereas of course, we can also see ourselves as political animals, as citizens. And that role really has become weaker, I think. So that is also one of the things that need to come back. And so I have a few proposals in the book. For example, I endorse a proposal by Deborah Zetz, professor of philosophy in Stanford, who argues for compulsory civil service in order to make people again more aware of their role as citizens. So that is actually also one of the surprising things for me. I thought I was going to write a book on inequality and then the upper end of it, but it ended up really also with more, it's like you pull one thread, and then you also have to start thinking about, okay, how does democracy work, because it's related. So we need to strengthen democracy. It's really a nexus between the power difference between, you could say, labor capital, between also making governments more accountable to the people, and then also making people more seeing themselves as citizens.
Yeah, we were discussing earlier this morning what were the kind of strategies that would be needed to pass some of these new reforms, and it does seem like it'll have to happen on multiple levels. On the one hand, building up unions sort of as an instrument of countervailing power, but then also creating some more community, more sense of shared citizenship between people. And we also were talking about, you bring up examples of new business models that sort of move away from the pure private ownership approach, where you have, you can think of cooperatives or nonprofit enterprises, or some things like the donut economy or community wealth building. All these are efforts to get the economy or economic ownership to be more widely distributed, so that there isn't as much of this tension between the owners and the workers in firms.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, how, as you've been having these discussions, what has been the kind of response or reaction in terms of developing movements to try to, I guess, yeah, how does limitarianism, you see, fit in with some of these shifts to rethink the economy?
So I think there are a number of these models, like the Decroat, or that where the people who work on these are really either endorse limitarianism or very sympathetic to it, or think that something like this will inevitably have to come. But it's also, I guess, a question I wanted to ask you, because one of the things that I haven't, I mean, you have historical expertise, but what do you see from what we know from history that works? Because what I, for example, want some of these models that are in the last chapter, I say, like, we should study these models and find out whether they hold promise. They are really at a very low level, at a micro level. Whereas I think in the end, neoliberalism was really something that changed the entire economy.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, because I think neoliberalism didn't happen in a vacuum, and this is me putting on my historian hat, but neoliberalism was building off of things that were happening even during the growth of the welfare state and social democracy, because under the welfare state, you still had the economy in largely private hands, and it was the means of the welfare state to distribute the proceeds of the private economy more fairly. But as long as the economy is seen as an engine of growth and as seen as being efficient, even if it's in private hands, then it sort of has this gloss of being sort of the proper order of things, that the economy should be in private hands. And once the welfare state runs into trouble, once we get stagflation in the 70s, the government is discredited, but somehow business is able to continue looking like the savior. And I think that that kind of shift was not just sort of a top-down coup by people like Milton Friedman, but it was something that was in people's daily lives for decades, the idea that, what's good for GM is good for America. And the alternative to that would be something like, what I get at in my book, which hopefully will be coming out soon with Chicago Press, which is called The Menace of Prosperity. And the alternative was in places like New York in the late 19th century, you had many workers developing cooperatives, and the cooperatives were providing them with employment and material goods, but also showing that there's other ways of running businesses. And once those cooperatives began to run into trouble, they looked to the state to sort of amplify those cooperatives and to curb the power of the wealthy. But this sort of new common sense was happening in people's ordinary lives, and that's how capitalism developed in the Middle Ages. It happened in towns and cities and then grew. That's how social democracy developed. I think now it needs to all happen at once. Like, we need to pass these caps on the wealthy, we need to rebuild the welfare state. But I think this other element of looking at how we can really fundamentally change people's daily lives, I think that is not as much present. And even people who look at alternative economics, they usually, I don't know if they're thinking of the transformative potential in a political sense as much. You know, I think they think, oh, it's nice to have businesses that respect the environment. They're not thinking, how can these businesses form a new political consciousness that can help undo some of the bigger troubles of our era. That's me coming at it from the historical sense, and also a little bit of my work with Cassie. Sorry for going on a little bit on that.
Yeah.
But
No, but I think that what I certainly agree is that we need kind of almost like an ecosystem of different measures. And yeah, I deliberately closed the chapter not with saying, okay, this is the model which I think we should have, but by letting it open. Yeah, that's for the future.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I think we've had some great, I'm grateful for you answering some of these questions, and now we can throw it open to you folks.
Hello, I'm Junseok. I'm from South Korea, and I have two questions about your arguments. First one is like, you assume that monopoly of wealth results in kind of ecological crisis. That's what I hard to understand, because it seems like monopoly of wealth is something sometimes result in the decrease of the pollution. Like when it comes to North Korea, Kim Jong-un has all the money and wealth, then they are kind of clean country. So and you guys, if all the American wealth belongs to Donald Trump, then you guys do not have money to run any individual vehicles, then you will be a very clean country too. So like what kind of connection between kind of monopoly of wealth and ecological crisis? That is my first question. My second question is, sometimes it seems like in Korea we have the term chaebol, which means collection of money, and all the Korean companies had kind of similar kind of trajectories. Like their developments based on the monopoly of wealth to certain families. Like Samsung, they are operated by Lee family kind of clan, and it was kind of effective way to protect their wealth, and it contributed to the growth of Korean economy, right? So this kind of when sometimes the monopoly of wealth and possession of wealth by certain group of people will and it contribute to the entire economy. So in that case also we should we make kind of uplift kind of the wealth of individuals? Like that is my second question.
Yes, I'll have to come back on the second question because I'm not sure I entirely understood that on the first question. So it's not about the monopoly of wealth, but it's about the concentration of wealth. So it's not that one person has all the wealth, like if you have a dictator. So that's also why, I don't talk about North Korea, because I just think that model is just off the table from the start, because it's a dictatorial no, I shouldn't use the word terrorist because that's overused, but no, it's clear it's violating human rights squared, etc. So I certainly want to protect basic liberal rights and especially democracy, and so I defend liberal democracy in the book, or I just say I think we should stand for this. But what we see so there's a relatively new literature on trying to see how people in different income groups, but also wealth groups, how both their lifestyles and, for the rich, their investments impact on the ecosystems. And what we see is that so the average, so take as an example climate, because there we have, I think, most of the data. The average emissions on a global scale is, I believe it's something like somewhere between 2 and 3 tons CO2 emissions or CO2 equivalent emissions per person per year. In Africa, except some of the oil producing countries in South Africa, it's 1, on average 1. In Europe, it's about, some European countries like, it's about 9, US 20. So you see big differences. But then, the 1% all over the world has an average of 101 tons per person. And if you look at billionaires, we're talking about thousands of tons per person per year. Why? Because of their private jets, because of their mansions, because of their multiple houses. I mean, private jets is, for example, really, I mean, I think there's an argument to just forbid them. Because it's really, really, I mean, we just can't afford this kind of consumption. So that is the argument. Now you could say, but what about this multimillionaire that has actually bought part of the Amazon to protect it? That would be a counter-argument to my argument, and I would accept that. The point is that statistically speaking, the super rich are actually on balance a burden for the ecosystems. They're harming the planet rather than saving the planet. And the thing with the arguments in the book is that for almost each of the chapters, except I think, I'm not sure about the chapter on dessert, you can find exceptions. But I think all the super rich, at least one of the arguments will apply to them. So it's like, we call this in argumentation theory, we call this the Swiss cheese model, that you have layers, and at least one of the arguments will apply to them. So, yeah. I'm not sure I understood your second question, but were you trying to argue about the importance of, say, family businesses for the economy?
Kind of concentration of wealth sometimes, helps, kind of keeping a country wealth, and sometimes there might be this kind of social agreements for that, concentration. So because we believed anyway, it was effective at the time.
Yeah, so I think, well, first of all, if a country believes and democratically decides after due discussion that it's better to have this, then that's what should happen. Clearly, I'm just providing arguments for public debate. But family businesses there are of course a few exceptions where we might not always have the data because they're not public. I think IKEA is a good example where, of course, over time it has become really big. But the argument in the book is about personal wealth. Now, I know that the distinction between personal wealth and company wealth is not always clear. In the case of family businesses is an important one, and this is one of the questions that I want to develop further in the future, together also with a colleague who is specialized in the political philosophy of the corporation. And you could, of course, so what for me is the most important thing is the reasons why I think there may be problems with wealth concentration. So if, of course, you have a country and a certain model where there is another reason why you want to have that wealth concentration, and you can give answers to the worries I lay out in the book, then that could be a solution. But it's hard for me to see, and then that may be a reason why you could say, okay, we will have a higher limit. But it would be hard for me to see how, definitely at the level of personal wealth, you would justify, say, billions or even hundreds of millions. It's hard to see how that would serve the economy of a country. But I think it's an area for future debate for sure.
One more question.
So a lot of what you've had to say has been pretty interesting. I'm myself an entrepreneur, and there's a lot of takes there that I have, but I have two main ones that I think most valued here. And the first one would be that people who have had the ability to generate that types of wealth, wouldn't you say that in some way they're benefiting society, right? Because I'm not talking about people who gain what they have from corruption or from family, like passing it on to them, or inheritance or whatever. I'm referring to people who find ways to benefit society and are rewarded for it. What would you have to say on that? Because I think that there's a lot of people who, yes, maybe they produce thousands of pounds in terms, like, referring solely to the point about billionaires, that they produce like thousands of pounds of, thousands of tons in carbon footprints through all their endeavors. But they aid like tens of thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people through jobs, through different aspects of their lives, right? Whether it's through constructing whatever they're trying to do or investments that they make. So isn't it kind of equivalent? Would you say that it's not? And then I have another one, but I'll let you answer this.
So yes, people who contribute to society, they may do a lot of, entrepreneurs may do a lot of good to society, but it doesn't follow that they should therefore be rich. There are lots of scientists who have developed vaccination. I describe in the book the person who developed the vaccine for polio. When he developed it, he took a patent and then gave it to several pharmaceutical companies so that he would be sure it would be rolled out quickly and efficient, and he didn't earn any money from this himself. Why? Because he was at the service of the public. So there are plenty of people who've done fantastic things for the whole of humanity and who have not become super rich for that. So I do think people who work hard and who contribute, they deserve a good living. But why would they have to become multimillionaires? There is just, I mean, we have absorbed that as almost as a truth that because they are contributing, hence they deserve everything they can get on the market. But the market itself is a social creation. And this is kind of hard for us to understand because the whole neoliberal thinking is that the market is so-called free. There is no such thing as a free market except if you drop some people in an island without any people, where they start from scratch. But in the societies that we have, markets are, I mean, property rights is something that is a social convention that we agreed with each other. The way we set up markets, the way we regulate markets. So that means that what you get as a return from your entrepreneurial activities on the market is already determined by the social contract. So I just think it is in the end unavoidably a political choice.
Now, if you look at how, I guess, humans have operated throughout history, most humans aren't alike. They aren't motivated by just doing good for others. They're motivated by doing good for themselves. And
is that true?
I would say most people do things out of self-interest, right? There are the exception, but I would say that a majority of people operate out of self-interest.
So there is somebody who's written a book, Rutger Bregman has written a book arguing the opposite. I just say, I think there's a mixture of people, there's a mixture of motivations. I mean, if everybody were to be completely altruistic, we didn't have to, under my proposals, we didn't have to have an upper limit that allows for these positive incentive effects. But yeah, I think we have to, so I also think that so it's interesting, there are people who've written about the assumptions in neoliberal thinking. So you mentioned Friedman and Hayek. So Friedman has said things like greed is good, but there is a certain view on human nature and on what drives humans that they have repeated and repeated and repeated until we've started to believe that this is natural. But why wouldn't this be natural? I think is the kind of, that there is a mixture of motives we have. And that, so I think we are also altruistic, we do things for other people, just only up to a certain degree. And so I think we have to find a balance, and I think we've now really moved too much to a society and to an economic scheme that rewards the strongest and that puts those who are motivated by financial or material self-interest that caters to their interests. I mean, if we were to really reward people who do most for society most, we would pay teachers and nurses much more money. That's one of the things I mean, we have people who are in financial sector who really just make money go around, but don't add really substantial value. They make lots of money, and we have nurses, childminders who earn very low wages. These are the things we should be talking about.